I think also that Trump needs to focus on freezing spending, cutting more government employees. That will really drive a lot more pressure on reducing spending, reducing the fiscal crisis that we have right now. We've got to, of course, touch Social Security and Medicare at some point, but these are good steps in the right direction. Hello. Welcome to this week's economy. I'm your host, Dr. Vance Ginn. Thank you for joining me again today. We've got a lot to talk about. There's been a lot going on here recently. I was over in Nacogdoches this past week visiting Stephen F. Austin University, where I spoke to a great group talking about entrepreneurship and the economy and everything else. And anyway, it was a great opportunity to be there. This week, I'll be in D.C. talking with members of Congress, talking about the importance of the technology sector, how we shouldn't overregulate it, whether it be at the federal or the state levels, and things of that nature. So I'll be doing some good work there. And I'll be at the Center Right meeting if many of you will be there at Americans for Tax Reform. So check that out as well. So with all that good stuff going on, let's get into what's happening. As you know, we've had more executive orders coming out of the White House. We've had cutting regulations, proposing a sovereign wealth fund. The announcements have been significant, as you know. One of the most anticipated, though, I think, is to dismantle the Department of Education, which I want to talk about today. And look, I hope this ultimately will pave the way for nationwide school choice movement, as we need the school choice revolution to continue, giving students and families more control over their education. So let me go ahead and get started here. Remember, you can find this at all your major podcast platforms out there and my show notes at vanceginn.substack.com. All right, here we go. Number one, inflation indicators. In the news this week, the first inflation reports of 2025 are going to be out. Don't miss them. The Consumer Price Index, or the CPI, the Producer Price Index, the PPI, will be released, providing fresh insights into price trends. Meanwhile, tariffs on Mexico and Canada are set to push up the cost of food and other goods that are out there. But of course, those were punted for about a month. I guess they want to see what else they can do, what sort of negotiations that they can have. And, my take on this is that I anticipate inflation to remain higher than what we would like for it to be. The Federal Reserve would like for these to be closer to 2%. We've been well above 2%, whether you look at the headline inflation or core inflation, which excludes food and energy, which we all buy, of course. But we've still seen too much inflation. And the reason why, of course, is we've had the Congress spending way too much money, running up massive deficits and debt. And then you have the Federal Reserve, our central bank, coming in, buying a lot of that debt, putting more money in the economy, and too much money chasing too few goods. You get inflation. And the Fed's balance sheet is still $6.8 trillion compared with the $4 trillion it was before the pandemic. It did go up to $9 trillion. So at least we're down some. What's that? $2.2 trillion, but it's still $6.8 trillion. This is a massive amount of money that's out there in circulation. And what I'm hoping for is that the White House can really push Congress through the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, right? And OMB with Russ Vought, hopefully there soon, to act, because they've got to be able to cut spending. I mean, yes, the DOGE and Elon Musk and others can do some things, nibble around the edges, but ultimately at the end of the day, the power of the purse is in the hands of Congress, and they've got to really do something. And we've also got to get off of these tariffs and protectionist sort of routes, because remember, that's nothing more than a tax on Americans. I think that there are better approaches to going after these folks. And a big part of this is be more competitive, reduce the cost of doing business here at home, and have more free trade agreement with our allies. That will force more pressure on China and other countries to change their trade habits and other things versus slamming Americans with higher taxes. All right. Number two, regulation and spending reform. In the news, President Trump has issued a wave of executive orders focused on government reform. One EO mandates aggressively regulatory rollback, requiring at least 10 old regulations to be eliminated for every one new one that's enacted. Either other orders attempt to freeze federal spending already approved by Congress. Additionally, the president has signed an EO directing the creation of a sovereign wealth fund, or at least looking into it, potentially to buy TikTok and invest in other things. I mean, look, I think the regulatory reform is great. Last time there was the 2-for-1, which was EO 13771. I think they're bringing that back. They're making it 2-to-1. But as I've talked about before, we don't want to just look at the number of EOs that are coming in and out. We actually want to look at the final rules and cost. I think we need a regulatory budget, and we have a regulatory limit, kind of like a spending limit, which I'll talk about in a minute. But those would be the ways to really get government out of the way as much as possible and allow for more opportunity to grow. I think also that Trump needs to focus on, freezing spending, cutting more government employees, that sort of thing. That will really drive a lot more pressure on reducing spending, reducing the fiscal crisis that we have right now. We've got to, of course, touch Social Security and Medicare at some point, but these are good steps in the right direction. What I don't think is a good right direction, though, is this sovereign wealth fund idea. I know that they're wanting to look at it at the federal level. I hope that they find that this is not a good idea. If they're listening to me, I would tell them it's not a good idea. Yes, some other countries have it, and they put assets, quote unquote assets, in there, like oil and gas and production revenue and things of that nature. But we don't want the government owning oil. We don't want the government owning private property that should be to the Americans in the private sector to allow for more growth and prosperity and innovation that will use those things more versus the government coming in and distorting these markets. And so I don't think that Trump should try to get a sovereign wealth fund. Look, we're doing a bad enough job with our own budget when you look at revenues and spending. We shouldn't have another fund that they can then make things worse through the process. And I also don't think, like Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick in Texas has called one of his policy priorities to be able to create a sovereign wealth fund in Texas. And we have an economic stabilization fund already in Texas, which flows in a lot of money from oil and gas, severance taxes, production tax credits. Instead of having all this additional money coming in Texas and other places, it should be returned to taxpayers. Cut those taxes and cut spending and return the money to the taxpayer instead. And don't just grow government. The idea here, I think, is that you can grow government or make expenditures that aren't really tied to the taxpayer. And so maybe it won't be so burdensome for the economy. But remember, the less that you have this connection between spending and taxes, the more that there will be incentive to spend and grow and therefore be more of a burden on the productive private sector. So we should not go in that direction. Speaking of fiscal crisis, number 3, Texas budget crisis. Despite strong economic growth, Texas is undermining its own success with reckless spending and misplaced priorities. There's just been too much spending in the budgets. When you look at the House budget and the Senate budget, I'm hopeful throughout this process they could find some cuts. I really think that they should use more of their budget surplus of $24 billion to go towards more property tax relief, school maintenance and operation property tax relief through compression by reducing the school M&O property tax rates, not by homestead exemptions or other things. And it should go up to at least $10 billion, which is what the governor called for in his State of the State address here recently, not the 6.5 billion. Trillions, billions, it all adds up to real money at some point, right? But the real amount of real relief is closer to $3 billion. So I think we need to see something closer to $10 billion in new relief in Texas and stop spending so much, guys. Cut spending where we can, or at least freeze the budget. This would put us on a much better pace moving forward. And also look at school choice efforts. You know, the Texas Senate just passed Senate Bill 2, which is a universal school choice bill where everyone would be eligible. There's only about $1 billion that's funded for it. And I've talked about this recently. That would fund about 95,000 students out of the 6.3 million kids in Texas. So about 1.5%. So it's not universal in that sense. There also are some other restrictions that I'd like to see moved out of place. Instead of giving cards to parents for them to use for education related services, it's actually approved by the comptroller, their office, in order to where those monies are going to go. I think that reduces the amount of flexibility and the competition and the benefits that we'll ultimately see. But look, it's not over yet. I think it's a good starting point. Even Chairman Senator Brandon Creighton, who's the author of the bill, said during his final remarks that, look, this is a good step in the right direction. So let's make sure that it's the best bill possible, and let's get it out of the House as well. Number 4, in the Department of Education at the federal level. In the news, the Trump administration is preparing an executive order to dismantle the Department of Education. We needed to do this. My take is you got to get the government out, the federal government out of education entirely. There's no there's no constitutional role for the Department of Education put in place during the Jimmy Carter years. We should get rid of that and just put in place some idea of how, maybe there's going to be some administrative sort of situation out of the federal government for education, but otherwise it should be left to the state and ultimately to the people, right? And I think that's what's so big about this school choice revolution that's going on. And when you look at the research on this, of 18 major studies on school choice, 12 found positive effects, including improvements in public schools due to increased competition, also increases in teacher pay. So I think that's the direction it needs to go. Senate Bill 2 or whatever's passed in Texas needs to be as universal as possible without bankrupting the state, okay? There shouldn't be an increase in school choice and an increase in public schools. We're already overfunding the government schools. If parents want to choose to send their kids elsewhere, those dollars should follow the child, not stay in the government school where those kids aren't even being served anymore. There's a clear direction of where this should go. Let's stop playing politics. Number 5, Why spending limits beat structural balance. A growing debate among fiscal conservatives is how best to rein in government spending through strict constitutional spending limits or structural balance rules. While structural balance aims to smooth government spending over time, critics like me, argue that it encourages more spending rather than limiting government growth. True fiscal conservatism means keeping government spending in check so it only grows at a rate taxpayers can afford. I had a recent piece in National Review, which will be in the show notes, but I really talk about how structural spending or strict spending limits, constitutional spending limits, is the way to go. It reins in government spending. It doesn't have the government growing as fast as the overall economy. And in particular, it allows for the average taxpayer the ability to pay for government spending, whereas structural balance allows for increase in government spending, and maybe they'll balance it later. But how can you trust politicians? Their incentive is always to spend more or raise taxes, which is contrary to balancing budgets because then you slow economic growth. I just think the structural balance approach is more of a Keynesian view that government should be spending more over time and it should be up to legislators and everything else, when my idea is that the Keynesian view fails every time and we need less government in our lives, not more. And that's due through less government spending, and spending is the ultimate burden of government on people. So that's really where I think this comes into play. With all that, thanks for joining me in this episode of This Week's Economy. For more insights, visit vanceginn.com and get even greater value with a paid subscription or complimentary subscription to my Substack newsletter at vanceginn.substack.com. God bless you and let people prosper.